Cyclops vel monoculus. The Latin sits in faded brown ink beside a red-skinned figure stooped under the weight of a slaughtered beast, somewhere in the interior of what the map calls Brasilia. One eye, a hunter, drawn with the same steady hand that traced the coastlines around him. The map is real, and it is enormous. Urbano Monti, a Milanese nobleman, completed it in 1587 across 60 hand-drawn sheets meant to lock together around a pin driven through the North Pole. Assembled as he intended, it stands 10 feet square, the largest known map of its century. Stanford's David Rumsey Map Center acquired the manuscript and, in 2017, digitally stitched the sheets into the single-image Monty imagined but almost certainly never saw whole in his lifetime. And down at the bottom of that image, where the known world runs out into blue, the creatures begin to gather. They crowd the southern edge. A merman with a long grey beard reaches a clawed hand toward a passing caravel. A bird large enough to carry an elephant hanging in its talons. A centaur wading through a sea Monty labels, in his own careful lettering, Oceano del Sur Glacial, the glacial southern ocean. All of them ring the same place, Terra Australis, the vast southern landmass that fills the base of the map where, today, we would draw Antarctica. And the question that gathers slowly, the longer you sit with it, is not a dramatic one. Why draw living things there at all? The historians have a clean answer, and it is a good one. Terra Australis was never observed, it was inferred. Ancient geographers reasoned the globe needed a great southern mass to balance the weight of the northern lands, and mapmakers dutifully drew a continent that no European had ever reached or seen. Monty himself never sailed. He was an armchair scholar who read travel narratives and copied from the masters, Mercator, Gastaldi, and above all, Olaus Magnus, whose Carta Marina of 1539 already swarmed with sea beasts. On his own Tavila 25, Monty lists his sources plainly, Pliny and Marco Polo among them. So the standard reading is almost dismissive in its reasonableness. The monsters are decoration, filler for empty ocean, recycled bestiary creatures copied from older charts to occupy water no European had crossed. Pretty nonsense, drawn precisely where real knowledge failed. And for most of Monty's map, that reading holds perfectly well. But here is the first thing that does not sit cleanly. Decoration by its nature goes where it is convenient. The blank ocean, the dead corner, the margin nobody needs. Yet Monty's southern creatures are not scattered as afterthoughts. They are concentrated, deliberately, along a coastline he drew with real care. And that coastline is the crack. Because the official story says Terra Australis was pure imagination, a placeholder shape with no reality behind it, yet Monty gives it rivers, mountains, named capes, forests rendered tree by tree. He drew an unknown continent with the specificity of a place that someone had physically walked. You can tell me this is simply the convention, that mapmakers dressed their imaginary lands to look plausible and inhabited. That is true, and I have sat with it a long time, but convention explains a decorated coast in general. It does not explain why the decoration stays so consistent from map to map, because Monty did not invent his southern beasts. He copied them, and when you follow them backward, into Olaus Magnus, into Sebastian Munster, into the Ptolemaic tradition, Monty openly cites the same categories of creature keep surfacing at the same southern latitudes, generation after generation of competing cartographers. The horned, tusked sea beast breaking the waves beside the little isle labelled Tristano. The spouting whale thing rising at the very rim of the world. The great taloned bird lifted, it turns out, straight from Marco Polo's account of the rock. These are not one man's whimsy. They are a shared inventory, and that is what unsettles me. Quietly, the more I look, whimsy diverges. If 60 different mapmakers were each inventing monsters to fill empty water, you would expect 60 different bestiaries. Instead, you find astonishing agreement about what lives in the far south, and about roughly where along that coast it lives. Now, the honest counter-argument, and it is a strong one. Copying is exactly why they agree. Renaissance cartographers borrowed shamelessly. A beast drawn by Olaus Magnus in 1539 would ripple forward through every atlas that came after. Uniformity is not evidence of a shared truth. It is evidence of a shared source. I know this. It is the most likely explanation, and I want to be genuinely fair to it. But notice that it only pushes the question one step further back into darker ground, because it quietly asks us to trust that the original source, the very first drawing in the chain, was itself pure invention. And here the record goes strangely quiet in a way that copying alone cannot explain, because Olaus Magnus did not claim to be inventing his sea monsters, he claimed to be recording them. Reports, testimony gathered from men who worked the far northern waters and came back describing things they insisted they had seen. So the chain runs like this. Monty copied Magnus, who recorded sailors, who described something. At every single link, the men involved believed they were documenting rather than imagining. The mapmakers thought they were being scientific. Monty's whole stated ambition, written on the map itself, was a universal scientific planisphere. That is the detail I cannot quite walk past. Monty was not a fantasist by temperament. He was a rigorous, humorless scholar who cross-referenced Pliny and Ptolemy and Jesuit letters, who cared deeply about latitude and climate and the length of a day. He set the beasts down in the same careful ink as the truth, and no one coordinated any of this. That is what makes it strange rather than simple. These were rival nations, rival guilds, map makers guarding commercial secrets, printing in competing cities beneath competing crowns. There was no committee anywhere deciding what would be shown to live at the bottom of the world. Yet they converged, not through conspiracy, nobody organized it, nobody could have, but through something quieter and much harder to name, a shared inheritance that everyone kept faithfully and almost nobody thought to question. The South was drawn as inhabited, again and again, by men who agreed on little else. A silence like that requires no plotter. It requires only that everyone find it easier to copy than to erase. That the beast on the old chart gets redrawn on the new one, because removing it would mean claiming to know better than the master who drew it first, and, reliably, almost no one ever did. There is a rational flaw beneath all of this, and I keep standing on it to make sure it holds my weight. The creatures are stock symbols. The centaur is Sagittarius. The mermaid is a moral emblem. The rock is lifted whole from the tales of Marco Polo, whom Monty read and named among his sources. Every one of them carries a tidy iconographic pedigree, and patient scholars can trace each back to a specific text. I have read those tracings. They are careful and largely convincing, and if the story ended there, I would close the map and be satisfied. But there is that coastline again, waiting. The symbols I can explain. The precision of the land they are standing on, I cannot. A cyclops is a myth you can source cleanly to Homer. But why place him inland, past named rivers, inside a continent the official story insists was never once seen, and then draw the rivers anyway, with such care? I am not telling you there were creatures walking a green and living Antarctica before the ice came. I have no map that proves the South was ever warm, no bone, no name written in Monty's steady hand that says here, this was witnessed by someone. I have only a pattern, and my own discomfort with it. What I have is a rigorous man who drew an unknown continent as though it were thoroughly known, filled it with the exact life the whole tradition insisted belonged there, and then called the finished result science. And a century of his rivals, who, given every reason to disagree with him, quietly drew the same things. Maybe it is nothing at all, but ink obeying older ink. Maybe every line traces back to a story, and every story back to some earlier man filling silence with precisely what he already expected to find down there. That is the likeliest answer, and I have made my peace with likeliest answers before now. But there is another version of the past in which some of that ink began its life as a report, where the first hand ever to draw the far south was not inventing anything, but writing down what it had been told by someone who had gone and returned. I cannot prove that version. I find I cannot quite dismiss it either. And if even one of those beasts began as testimony rather than as symbol, then the question stops being why Monty drew life at the bottom of the world. It becomes something colder and far older and much harder to set back down. Who first saw it there, and why did everyone who came after agree to keep drawing it,